on our website, hopefully by mid next week. So it should be available at some point next week on our website. The idea is that this is the first of 2 webinars. We're going to run through the overview of what's required starting in January, and then the next webinar we will kind of touch on the same items, but use the questions from today to help inform some of that other discussion that we'll have at the next webinar. As far as the questions and comments are concerned, we're going to be using idea boards. So there's a link there on the bottom. And if you click on that link, actually you can't click on the link, but we put the link into the chat. So if you click on the link in the chat, it will take you to this idea board. And we have 2 separate sections here, the one on the left side for today's meeting and one on the right side for the meeting in December. So please use the left side. And if you want to add a comment or a question, please click on that green plus symbol and a little sticky note will pop up and you can start typing in your question. And this will allow us to keep the questions and help us to develop the next webinar. And aside from putting in your questions, if you see a question there that you already intend to ask, but you're really interested in finding out the answer, you can click on the actual sticky note and it will allow you to give it a thumbs up. And so we'll try to get through all of the questions today, but we will try to prioritize the ones that it looks like there's a lot of interest in. So please use that function and we'll use that to help prioritize our question and answers today and then help us to develop the next webinar using those questions in particular. Yeah, for the benefit of the people that just joined, if you can please mute yourselves and turn off your cameras if you have them on. And the questions and answers we'll be using idea boards, and there's a link to it in the chat here on Teams. And their screen is shown right here as an example. And again, you can hit the plus symbol on the left right here where John has it, and that will pop up a new sticky note and you can write your comment there or your question. And then you can upvote previous questions to help us see which questions have the most interest so that we can prioritize those when we answer them. Okay, I believe that's all we had for the housekeeping. I guess I'll turn it over now to Jonathan Thompson. For those that don't know him, he's a senior environmental scientist with our program, and he works a lot with ballast water treatment technology, data, and in that whole realm. So, Jonathan, if you want to take it over.
Not a problem. Thank you, Chris. And welcome, everybody. I'm pretty excited to be delivering this presentation today. Today, I'm talking about the California's ballast water requirements and some changes that we have coming up from some new regulations and some new statute. So the background for this, really quickly, the purpose of the Marine Invasive Species Program, I just wanted to touch on that to help to give us a frame for our conversation today. The purpose of the Marine Invasive Species Program is to eliminate the discharge of non-indigenous species from vessels arriving at California ports. And this applies to vessels that are 300 gross registered tons or more and are carrying or capable of carrying ballast water. The California has existing ballast water management requirements, and those requirements, the goal of those requirements is to reduce the risk of introducing non-indigenous species into state waters. And there are management options for those, for vessels. They include ballast water exchange, using an acceptable alternative, discharging to a reception facility, although none exist right now, and then retaining all ballast water and then using ballast water from a public water system. The Marine Invasive Species Program has been moving towards implementing ballast water discharge performance standards. In advance of implementing California's interim standards in 2020, the Commission was required to submit a report to the legislature on the availability of technology at meeting those interim standards. That report was in 2018 and was that report to the legislature found that no technologies were available to enable vessels to meet California interim discharge standards. And those standards are more strict than the existing federal ballast water discharge performance standards. So in line with the recommendations from the Commission in that report, AB 912 became law in 2019. That act amended California's Marine Invasive Species Act. It required the Commission to implement the existing federal ballast water discharge performance standards. That doesn't mean VITA, it's the existing standards. So the pre-VITA federal ballast water discharge performance standards. And it also delayed the interim and final ballast water discharge performance standards to 2030 and 2040 respectively. So as a result from the mandates in that 2019 law, California has adopted new regulations, and there's also some a new piece of California legislation. And the new regulations that are adopted do what the AB 912 was mandating, and that's to implement the federal ballast water discharge performance standards and that schedule. It also authorizes the Commission to collect ballast water samples for research and compliance purposes. It establishes conditions for those ballast water samples for compliance assessment and research purposes. So for research, the Commission staff members may collect and analyze ballast water and sediment samples and must be given access to ballast water tanks and sampling ports when feasible. The new regulations also establish requirements for vessels to monitor the use of ballast water treatment systems. This includes monitoring and recording operational parameters and calibration activities. Also, based on the new regulations, vessels can use water from a public water source as long as they follow the record keeping requirements for that. In addition, resulting from the recently enacted AB 822, the Commission can grant the use of an alternative when a ballast water system isn't functioning properly. And I'll get into the details of that a little bit more later on in this presentation. So what are the federal ballast water discharge performance standards that California will implement? So as part of the recently adopted regulations that I mentioned, California will be implementing the federal ballast water discharge standards and other provisions for vessels arriving at California ports. These changes will become effective January 1, 2022. So just about a month and a half away. The details of these ballast water discharge standards are in the following table. Many of you may be already familiar with the U.S. federal ballast water discharge standards. These performance standards set limits on the allowable number of organisms to be discharged in ballast water based on a volume of water and number of organisms in that volume of water for 3 classes of organisms. I won't get into the details of this table other than to highlight the 3 organism classes. The 3 organism classes are organisms greater than or equal to 50 micrometers in minimum dimension. Organisms less than 50 micrometers and greater than or equal to 10 micrometers. And then there's indicator microorganisms. You can see in that bottom left-hand corner there. So those are the three organism classes. So which vessels will need to comply with California's ballast water discharge performance standards? This is broken up into two groups, and it's vessels with an extension to their compliance date from the United States Coast Guard. So vessels with this extension will need to comply with California's ballast water management requirements. So I'll state it again. We did get a few questions on this ahead of the webinar. So if vessels have an extension, they'll need to comply with California, the ballast water management requirements that are in place now. I mentioned them earlier. We'll go over them again. It's retaining all ballast water, exchanging ballast water an appropriate distance from land. Appropriate distance depends on the last port of call and the source of the ballast water, and whether one or both of those was inside or outside the Pacific Coast region. Also, vessels can use an approved alternative, such an alternative management system. And vessels under extraordinary circumstances may also request an alternative. Now, the other group of vessels are vessels without an extension to their compliance date. So these are vessels that are subject to the federal ballast water discharge standards. They don't have an extension, so their compliance date is active. If they're discharging into California waters, they need to meet the federal ballast water discharge performance standards. Vessels can also use water from a public water source. And vessels may also request an alternative if the vessel's ballast water management system is not operating properly. And the process for how going about doing that is to contact the commission, much like vessels would have to contact the Coast Guard if their ballast water treatment system isn't operating properly ahead of their arrival, or when it's not operating properly and they know that they're coming into California, let us know. And then we're required to consult with the Coast Guard and come up with an alternative. Okay, so for vessels that are using a ballast water treatment system that are subject to the discharge standards, there's some record keeping that activities that need to be recorded, and these records need to be maintained on board. And here's some details of what we'll be looking at when we get on board. So for functional monitoring and for calibration activities, it's the records need to be kept for 2 years. 2 years of printed or electronic records. So for biological monitoring, any biological monitoring, if this is like the commissioning tests or for the treatment systems, or if it's the EPA tests that are required, the records for those tests are required to be in either printed or electronic form, and they should be from any monitoring in the past 2 years, and they should include who was doing the testing, so who collected and analyzed the samples, when the monitoring occurred, and the methods that were used. Additionally, the ballast water treatment system type approval certificate should be maintained on board the vessel, as well as any equipment malfunction procedures. Those should also, so procedures if a vessel has a malfunction with its ballast water treatment system, those should be maintained on board the vessel. And then a few other items. So any material safety data sheets, MSDS for the ballast water treatment systems, and the chemicals that the ballast water treatment systems may use. Those MSDS are required to be maintained on board the vessel, including let's see, also ballast water treatment system manuals, technical guides, publications maintained on board the vessel. This next section wasn't part of the regulations, but the regulations did put them into force. They're from the existing Marine Invasive Species Act, and it requires vessels to keep a record of ballast water treatment systems, use, the date, the time, the location that the system was started and stopped, any system malfunctions, and also a record of any scheduled or unscheduled maintenance. So just to summarize, we have two vessels here. It's actually the same picture, but we'll just assume they're two different vessels. One vessel has an extension and one vessel does not have an extension. So vessels, as a reminder, vessels with an extension are required to still comply with California's existing ballast water management requirements. So that's retain all ballast water, do the exchange at an appropriate distance from land, use an appropriate approved alternative, such as an alternative management system, or they also may request an alternative under extraordinary circumstances. So it's one of those. And then for vessels without an extension, if they're discharging in California waters, they need to be meeting the federal discharge performance standards. They can also use water from a public water source as long as they have a record of which public water source it came from, and also the vessels, if they've used water from basically from any bay, estuary, or river, basically it's ambient water. If they've used that, they need to clean their piping and their tanks as well. And vessels, as I mentioned earlier, that similar process to what is in place now with the U.S. Coast Guard. Vessels may request an alternative if the vessel's ballast water management system is not operating properly. You're supposed to contact us. Our requirement for us is that you need to contact us if you're coming into California and the vessel's system isn't operating properly. And yeah, so that's the alternative. And with that, I haven't checked the idea board, and maybe Chris can let me know, but with that, we'll start taking questions, and we'll either be taking the questions, we'll be able to answer the questions today, or we do have a webinar coming up in December, and we'll address any questions that we feel like we need to explain a little better.
Sounds good. Thanks, John. So would you be able to switch over to the idea boards page? There are a couple of questions.
Yeah, give me a second and I'll pull it up, Chris.
Sure. And just a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions, the idea boards link is in the chat function of Teams. So if you use that link, you can go and put a question up, or you can show your interest in some of the other questions that are already posted. So as Jonathan's doing this, I'll start with the first question. Oh, there's several more now. Good. So the first question, John, is about the U.S. federal standards that we're implementing, and whether that's equivalent to the 2013 BGP requirements on page 29. And for reference, page 29 of the VGP references the federal ballast water discharge standards that were incorporated by the EPA during this with the 2013 VGP.
So the question is, when we're talking about the U.S. federal standards, are we talking about the 2013 VGP standards, or the federal standards? Correct. I mean the Coast Guard standards.
Yes. Yep.
Right. So, and I think what you said is that I think you already answered it, right? The VGP incorporates the Coast Guard standards.
So they'd be functionally the same, but our regulations specifically implement or incorporate the Coast Guard standards in the Code of Federal Regulations.
Right. Yeah. So it's and just to clarify, the California is implementing the numeric part of the federal standards and the schedule for that. So I hope that clears it up.
Okay, so the next question is asking for confirmation if we will allow vessels to use an AMS for 5 years past their original or extended U.S. Coast Guard compliance date.
As long as they have an existing extension to the federal their federal compliance date, will allow them to utilize an alternative management system. That's part of the new regulations.
And maybe one extra bit to add on to that is once the vessel is subject to these regulations, once their compliance date is over, there's no requirement in the state regulations that would require the use of any particular system. It's just the performance standards that would have to be met using whatever system the vessel owner chooses.
Thanks, Chris.
The next question is about public water source and whether that is equivalent to public water anywhere or just from the US.
Do you want to take this one, Chris?
Sure. So the language in the regulation that allows for the use of public water source has requirements that were incorporated from federal requirements that describe what would be considered public water source for use in ballast water as ballast water. It doesn't describe any specifics about where that water comes from, as long as it meets the standards that are incorporated in that regulation. So it essentially describes what needs to be met for that water to be used, and that water can come from anywhere. It doesn't have to be within the US.
Right, as long as they have a record of where it came from.
Yeah. Okay, the next question is whether this is different from the VITA requirements.
Yes, this is different from the VITA requirements.
And we'll maybe note also that the VITA proposed requirements have not been finalized, so there aren't any real standards from VITA in place at the moment. So yeah, this is all the pre-existing Coast Guard requirements.
Right. Yeah. The EPA is still working on finalizing the standards for that, and then after that, the Coast Guard has to work on their implementing regulations.
Okay. So the next question says if a ballast water treatment system is not operating properly, how should the commission be contacted? First question, via email. What information details should be shared? The commission should be contacted before U.S. Coast Guard, or should the commission be contacted before the U.S. Coast Guard? Would you like me to?
Yeah.
Sure.
And we can, this might be something that we can follow up with more detailed information in our presentation in December.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. So the idea is that the notice to the Coast Guard and the notice to us would be at the same time. We've had that happen pretty frequently when this occurs, that the email will be sent to the local captain of the port and also copied to us. And that's we can clarify that in the next webinar and in our outreach. And that could happen through an email to our general BW forum inbox, or we have several other email addresses that we can forward to, and we'll make sure to touch on that during the next webinar. And the information or details to be shared are essentially the details around the malfunction and why the system is not operational. And in most cases, the vessel will inform us in the Coast Guard what their ballast water management plan has as a backup plan for when this would occur. And typically the Coast Guard and we would consult with the Coast Guard to come up with an alternative and give that direction to the vessel. So that's already happening in some cases, and we're just formalizing it now through this regulation or through the statute. Okay, so the next question is the differences with the extension and without the extension are confusing. Why could the vessel with an extension not use public water?
I apologize if that was confusing, but the vessels with an extension can use public water source.
Well, I guess the difference right now is that the statute, the new statutory changes and the regulations specifically allow for the use of public water source as ballast water. In the existing requirements, the statute doesn't explicitly allow for it. So what we've done typically is allowed the vessels to petition for an alternative source of management, and in this case, using public water source. And so we would go through that alternatives process and allow them to use it to do that.
Right.
And the new requirement doesn't require that alternative request.
So they would have to request an alternative.
Yeah.
If they have an extension.
Yes. And it's just a function of the overlying statute, the Marine Invasive Species Act. It doesn't allow for that right now.
Okay. I can handle the next question, Chris. What is the estimated frequency of inspection and samples collected? So we still have our requirement, or our mandate to inspect and collect samples, ballast water samples and sediment samples from 25% of the arrivals into California. So we anticipate that we will be doing inspections. We will be looking at the records for the ballast water treatment system use for those vessels that are beyond their compliance date. And we are currently working out the details of how we will be going about collecting samples from vessels. But there is a chance that vessels that are discharging could have samples collected and analyzed for compliance starting after January 1st of 2022. But we don't have an estimate for the frequency of that. Do you want to add anything, Chris, to
that? No, other than the idea is that, as John mentioned, we have that mandate to inspect 25% of the arrivals, and during that inspection, not all inspections would result in a sample collection and analysis, and that there would be certain triggers that would move us in that direction. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so the next question asks, do the companies or vessels have to take any actions or to update the ballast management plan or internal procedures when they call California ports?
This might be something that we can add in. I don't want to say something that's incorrect right now, and we can add in to clarify at the December webinar, Chris, unless you wanted to take this one. Just scanning ahead, I've seen some other questions that I feel like we could give a much clearer answer.
Sure. With this one, maybe we'll just say that the actions to take would be to make sure that those monitoring and record keeping requirements that Jonathan mentioned are up to date, and that that the monitoring is taking place and the systems are being used within the system design limitations, and those are things that we will likely be looking at during the inspections to check for compliance. So it isn't necessarily something different for California, but it's some of the things that we've called out specifically in these regulations that we will be looking for. Okay, so the next one is the use of an AMS for 5 years after the U.S. Coast Guard compliance date is not tied to issuance of an extension under 33 CFR 151/2026C. Would appreciate understanding why this is being stated today.
What do you think, Chris? Do you want to take a stab at answering this? I feel like 90% confident in my answer, but I don't want to say something that's incorrect, and this might be something that's good to push to the December webinar, unless you feel confident about your answer, if you have one.
I guess I'm a little uncertain of the direct question, but again, the idea is that we are not requiring the use of any particular type of system. It doesn't have to be a type approved system or an AMS. The state doesn't require the use of a certain technology. So if the vessel is beyond their compliance date and are subject to the performance standards here in California, then that's the requirement. And there's no requirement for using a type approved system or an AMS. That part is irrelevant to our enforcement. But we can dig in a bit deeper, and if whoever wrote this question, if you can, we can follow up with the person who wrote it. Just let us know, and we'll get some more details, and we'll definitely make sure to touch on this at the next webinar.
And I feel like I keep pointing to you, Chris. We've had some internal discussions about the next question, or what are the alternatives the commission will allow if ballast water treatment system is not operating properly. If you want to take that one, Chris, or we can get into more details about that one in December as well.
Sure, and again, this would be in consultation with the U.S. Coast Guard, and my understanding of the way that they typically handle these requests is that they allow the vessel to use a different type of management that's listed in their ballast water management requirements, and that includes ballast water exchange. And in some of the cases that I've seen, they've directed the vessels to do an exchange at a certain distance from land, on a one-time basis while the system is being fixed. And so our process would be to consult with the local captain of the port and to provide some input on that, and hopefully come to some concurrence that we're giving the ideas that we're giving the same direction to the vessel when this happens.
Thanks, Chris. And I think we've already addressed this, and it's definitely something that we'll clarify at the December webinar about what the U.S. Coast Guard is doing as far as the extensions that they allow, and then what California's requirements are. And like, to echo what Chris said, is that even if a vessel is beyond their compliance date, California can't require vessels to use a treatment system or a Coast Guard type approved system. And that's just for the California part of it. But we'll try to get in and clarify this some more at the next meeting. And sorry if there's confusion about what the Coast Guard requires and what California's requirements will be.
And to clarify a bit, within these new regulations, we are incorporating the federal code, and specifically it's 33 CFR 151.2030 for the performance standards themselves, and then 2035 for the schedule. And those are the two sections that we've incorporated. Okay, so the next question is, so in 2022, what do you need from a vessel when she enters California for the first time in the new calendar year? For example, sampling calibration results.
So yeah, the vessels would need to have, if it was the sampling results, it would be, they should have records going back 2 years on board the vessel, describing, as I mentioned in the presentation, who did the sampling, when it was done, and the methods that were used. And then as far as calibration, as far as I know, calibration's in activity. So going through the process of the calibration actions that are recommended by the manufacturer of the ballast water treatment system for the treatment system that's installed on board. Those records need to be kept for the previous 2 years. They can be in printed or electronic format. Hope that answers that question.
And I'll also add on that the sampling part of it, that we don't specifically require the sampling, but the requirement is if sampling has occurred, then the records need to be retained.
Right.
Okay, so the next one is, do you advise what number of vessels have failed the samples and where the vessels came from, or what systems they were using for dealing with? I don't know if that finished.
There, I can take this one, Chris.
Sure.
Yeah, we don't have, we haven't done the direct sampling for that. There's lots of organizations around the world. This is a big question that's trying to be answered by a lot of folks from around the world. But certainly as we begin to collect samples and collect information about what we're seeing, we'll make that known on a regular basis, at the very least in our biennial report.
And next question is, if California standards until 2030 are equivalent to the U.S. Coast Guard, if the U.S. Coast Guard standards change when the Coast Guard finalizes its VITA revisions, do the California standards auto update?
So I think this is a question about what happens when VITA is implemented.
Yeah, and what happens? And
yeah.
Whether we have to take any action to amend our regulations, or if that just happens automatically.
I'm not, Chris, do you know what the answer to this is? I know what happens with VITA, but as far as what we would need to do with our regulations.
Yeah, so the VITA requirements would supersede ours if their standards are less strict. What if the standards change, then we would follow on with a regulatory change to match that.
Right.
Yeah, because we would at that point be prohibited from having standards that are more strict than the federal standards under VITA. But that would take an action on our part to amend the regulations.
Right. The next question are amendments to the existing enforcement regulations to be proposed. I think this gets at what we're going to be doing about the enforcement regulations. I have some tangential knowledge of what's going on with that, but Chris might be able to answer that better.
Yeah, we are working behind the scenes to update the enforcement regulations that currently only it provides a transparent framework for applying penalties for different types of violations, and right now it only applies to violations the existing previous ballast water management actions and exchange, and so we're working to update that to incorporate transparent processes for violations of these performance standards, but also violations of our biofouling standards. And so our hope is to have that rulemaking process be open to the public for public comment at some point in the early part of next year. And then we would go through that rulemaking process with public comment and eventual voting on by our commission. So that's in the works right now, and the timeline would be roughly early next year to start that, and then likely late summer to early fall by hopeful completion.
Thanks, Chris. So what would be the triggers to sample analysis, to sample and analyze from inspections, poor ballast water management plan, reporting? Yeah, I think this is going to be. Do you want to take this one, Chris? I don't want to speak for the program on this point.
Yeah, so this is something that we're still working on, but there are certain things that we're discussing about whether the system is operating within its system design limitations, and if there's if it was operating outside of that, then there's that's a flag for us, and that would push us towards that sample collection process. There are other items that could be used are the vessel's history of compliance or non-compliance with us, and again, those are just a couple of the ideas that we've been trying to finalize, but we don't have that process in place yet. But essentially, there would have to be some, in our case, we would move towards that the sampling part of the inspection if there were indicators that the vessel is likely to be non-compliant. And a poor ballast water management plan could be one of those triggers because it aligns with the history of compliance or non-compliance.
And then a follow-on question. I think it's just a coincidence that they happen to be next to each other. Has the State Lands Commission made any decision about what equipment will be utilized for indicative compliance monitoring? We're still continuing to evaluate the different indicative testing tools that are out there.
Yeah, and our goal is once the new year rolls around and these regulations are in place and we start working through some of these processes, that we're going to have our own version of this experience building phase to try to help us narrow down our processes. And to go back to one of the previous questions, we will be inspecting, and if there is detection of non-compliance, we will be writing violations. But our ability to put penalties on those violations is dependent on those enforcement regulations that we're going to be updating next year. So that interim period we're going to be using as an experience building phase for us to try to make sure that our processes are honed in.
Right. Yeah. And I think that gets to, there's a tile below that, Chris, about could you prepare a list of violation penalties and associated costs that you will enact in 2022 in the December webinar, and be more than happy to add in. There's as Chris has mentioned a couple of times already, we need to update the enforcement regulations for there to be costs and penalties associated with violations to any of these new regulations or statute. But we can put in some clarifying information about what violations after 2022 will have penalties and costs associated with them, potentially.
Yeah, and during that public rulemaking process, the entire rule, including the potential maximum penalties for the different violations, will be a part of that document that the public will be able to provide comment on. So there will be opportunities to comment on that next year.
The next question, Chris, the extension letter of the U.S. Coast Guard is valid in California, or the vessel has to choose one of the alternatives?
I'm assuming that this is asking that. So I'm going to answer that if a vessel has a U.S. Coast Guard extension letter, then we would honor that in California, and the previous management actions, the current management actions would apply. So that would be, as Jonathan mentioned, retaining ballast water or conducting a ballast water exchange at an appropriate distance, or requesting or using an approved alternative like AMS, or requesting a different type of alternative under extraordinary circumstances. So yeah, those would apply for a vessel that has a current extension from the U.S. Coast Guard.
Right. I think the next slide points out that saying that the requirements from before January 1st, 2022, I think this is saying that the requirements maybe that we were implying that they would stop on January 1st of 2022. It just which vessels that they were going to be applied to after January 1st of 2022. And the I think it's probably in the future we'll refer to them by their the type of regulation or the California Code of Regulations, that the actual number from that, and that maybe will help to alleviate confusion, and it will move us away from having to refer to ballast water management requirements or performance standards. So
yeah, we appreciate the suggestion.
yeah. Next question: does California follow the non-punishment agreement within IMO for ships failing discharge standards during the experience building phase? So California is not part of the IMO, and neither is the United States as far as signing on to that. So we will be for vessels that we collect a sample from and analyze that samples, we would be potentially issuing violations for that. Do you want to add anything, Chris?
Just to reiterate that the penalty portion of those violations would not be in effect until we have those enforcement regulations updated. So it by default we will have a similar time period where we won't be applying penalties that we're going to be using to help us with our experience building.
Thanks, Chris. We already addressed that next tile, and we'll definitely put that in for the December webinar. And then the next one is has gotten a few votes, and that's definitely something that we will do, is to put in frequently asked questions document. We do have a information sheet that's floating around, but there's certainly some questions that have come up here that I think we could either clarify the information that's in our information sheet or answer some of the questions that are that have been asked.
Yep, sounds good. Yeah, we do have a similar frequently asked question guidance document that we put out prior to our biofiling regulations going into effect, and so we can do something similar here with a lot of these questions that are coming in during this webinar and for obviously for the next webinar as well. Okay, well, it looks like we got to the end of these questions with 4 minutes to spare. So I guess we can close and thank you all for your participation and your great questions. They really helped us put some things into perspective for the next webinar, and we'll definitely use them to develop that next webinar. And if you haven't already registered for that webinar, it's the same email address. Just go ahead and let us know that you're interested in that second webinar, and feel free to share that broadly within your networks. And yeah, we'll hopefully have a successful webinar next time as well. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and oh, Chris, can I add one thing?
Sure.
Just about the idea boards that feel free to add
Yes.
add in any questions that you might come up with between now and December, and we'll add them in and answer those questions at the December webinar.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. And again, this will be posted on our website probably within a week. All right.
Thanks so much.
Have a good day.
Thank you.